They say that in life, we don't regret the things that we did as much as the things that we didn't do. And in my case, I can say that it's true. I don't regret riding a motorcycle and having a Jeep, even though at some point both of them tried to kill me. Or studying abroad for a year in France, even though it set my college graduation back and it cost me a boyfriend. Or moving to San Diego with my husband, even though it meant leaving our friends and both of our families behind in LA. Because every time that I took a chance and I said yes to the unexpected and I opened my arms and my heart to new experiences, I met someone new. And every person that I've known in my life has been a link in a long chain of unique and diverse individuals that took me from a place of anxiety and exclusivity to a world of openness and inclusivity. Human connections have enriched my life and given it meaning and purpose. When we're children, our worlds are very small. Our entire universe is just our houses and our families. And that's how it was like for me when I was a kid growing up. My whole world was my parents and my sisters. My sisters were my best friends and my worst enemies, my partners in crime and my faithful confidants. My sister Evelyn was a budding gymnast, and she spent the whole day outside tumbling and climbing things. My sister Gabby, she loved to draw and tell stories, and she was extroverted and sociable, and she had a lot of friends. Me, I liked doing physical things and playing sports, but talking to people, that was just terrifying for me. I loved to read, and I had a lot of books, and so I lived vicariously through the characters in my books and my sister's adventures. My sister Gabby, in high school, I had lunch with her or by myself, and she was my social coach. And she would say to me, go out there, talk to people. Do they know you? Do you know them? Are you ever going to see them again? And sometimes that worked, and it gave me a little push, but for the most part, talking to strangers was just sheer torture for me. And I preferred to just stay in my corner and read my books. I grew up in Argentina in a homogeneous, traditional society that was full of rules for behavior. And I had one friend. She was my best friend. And her name was Miriam. But a lot of people called her una loca, a crazy girl. Why? Because she broke all the rules of our society. Well, most girls had long, straight hair like me. Miriam had a massive curly hair. While everyone wore dark clothes and subdued, no patterns or anything, Miriam, she wore bold patterns and bright clothes. When families lived in houses, in the outskirts of town, she lived in an apartment downtown on the top floor of the only building, the only tall building in our town. When she turned 15, instead of the normal traditional quinceañera with the family, Miriam decided to have a night at a disco with her friends, no family. And her parents were older, and they pretty much let her do whatever she wanted. But my parents debated for hours before deciding to let me go. And they were a bit upset when I said we'd be spending the night at our house after the disco, not at her house with her parents. And they almost had a fit when we came home from the disco at 4 a.m. in a taxi. This lack of conventionality that made people just cross their arms when they saw Miriam coming and say to me, "Why are you friends with that crazy girl?" was what fascinated me and attracted me to her. Miriam didn't care, about el que dirán, like they say in Spanish, and what people thought about her or said about her. She just ignored the rules, and she said yes to wild hair, and yes to bright clothes, and yes to ditching mass, and yes to singing loudly in public. Her friendship challenged me. It gave me perspective, and it made my world a little larger. My parents' desire to give our family a better future brought us to California when I was 15 years old. And we lived in a condo community that was full of teenagers, just like us, but they didn't speak Spanish, and they had no idea where Argentina was. They would ask us if we ate fried bananas and burritos and tacos, and my sisters and I were like, what? Burritos y tacos? We don't eat donkeys and the heels of our shoes in Argentina. And if you speak Spanish, you know what that means. But these kids, they were our first American teachers and guides in this new country, and they opened our hearts and our minds to the English language with their silly stories and all of their jokes. And they introduced us to American classics like going to drive-in movies and eating hot fudge sundaes and playing Marco Polo in the pool and TPing the condos on New Year's Eve. They embraced our Latinness, and they adopted us into the condo kids community, and they made this new country feel like home. In high school, I made friends with all the Mormon girls on my volleyball team. And before then, the only Mormons I'd ever seen were the nice young men who rode their bicycles in white shirts and ties around our neighborhood in Argentina. And my mother, who was an English teacher and had no intention of converting to Mormonism, nevertheless, she opened her arms and our house to these wholesome young men who were alone and far from home. And she invited them into our house for milk and cookies and some English conversation. And that's how the Mormon girls treated me. They opened their hearts to me. They invited me into their community, and I went to their camping weekends and their parties on Friday nights, and I even played volleyball on the Mormon church volleyball team. And even though, they were so warm and caring and loving, and even though my access to their community was limited because I wasn't Mormon, they made me feel special, and they made me feel like I belonged. And I didn't have to eat lunch by myself anymore. My parents were both educators. My dad was a medical school professor in Argentina, and my mom was a high school English teacher and administrator here in the US. So my going to college was a given. I had grown up around academics who valued education above everything else. When I went to UCLA, at first it was a daunting experience. The campus is huge, and it's just so full of people, strangers. And, but at least I didn't have to fit in, nobody knew me. And at first I connected with other students who were like me. Lots of people ate alone, walked alone, they went to class alone, they sat alone. And, so I just hang out with those people who were bookish and reserved and shy. But after a while, those connections led to stronger friendships and connections that opened up new and exciting doors for me. A random invitation to go to a rec class introduced me to a community of intramural athletes, and with them I played beach volleyball, and I took dance lessons, I learned how to sail and cross-country ski. I opened my arms and my heart to students from other cities and other states who had different backgrounds and different interests from me. And for the first time in my life, I had a full and lively social life, probably too lively for my parents. But I wasn't afraid of people anymore. And as a matter of fact, I began to seek them out. In my Russian class, I found out that UCLA had a study abroad program that you could go and study abroad in another country for the same price as the tuition, regular tuition for a year at UCLA. And I know Alexa's going to UCLA, and maybe there's others here who are going to UCLA, so just don't cry. But in my days, UCLA cost $425 a quarter. And I paid for that with my part-time job. So anyway, I applied to go to Europe. My sister Gabby did too, and she went to Spain, and I went to France. Going to France changed my life. I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't gone to France. Now, obviously, I'm a Spanish and a French teacher today, so going to France, living there, I became trilingual. But going to France just had caused a deep change in the way I feel about talking to people, and I'm able to stand up here and talk to you because of my year there. How did I become trilingual? I did it by talking to strangers and pursuing relationships with people who spoke French. They say that California is a melting pot, but I have never been as steeped in diversity as I was during my year in France. First of all, the other students on the EAP program, they were all from all the UCs in California, and each one of them brought a different flavor of California to our study abroad community. Some of them have remained my lifelong friends, or my bridesmaids at my wedding, for example. When we first got to Montpellier, to the University of Montpellier in the summertime, the only other students there were foreign students like us. Students from Morocco, Algeria, Senegal, the Ivory Coast, who couldn't afford to go home for the summer. And they were my first Francophone friends. We connected over couscous in the dorm cafeteria, or playing volleyball, of course, after French class. My friend Gégé from Rwanda, he was a coach, And he got me into the university co-ed team, and then the women's team, and then a club team. And eventually from there, I went on to make a lot of French friends who just meant the world to me. They opened their homes to me, they opened their hearts to me, and they fed me delicious things. They showered me with love and attention. They took me out sightseeing on the weekends, and they comforted me when I was feeling homesick. And they even graded my papers, papers on Baudelaire, horrible things. And they just were the best thing that happened to me during that year in France. Over my 35 years as a teacher, I have been back to Europe countless times with my husband and my kids to visit my sister, Gabby, who after college, she went back to Spain, she married a Spaniard, and she never came back. But also with my students, with the exchanges that we have created here at Bonita with schools in Italy and in France. And these exchanges have opened my students' hearts and minds to new cultures and different people. And they have expanded their communities and continued expanding my own. I have learned a fourth language, Italian, and between the exchanges and my work as an AP reader for French, I have added educators in many countries to my professional community. And together we support each other professionally and personally. We exchange ideas and resources and lessons and strategies. And together we collaborate to find solutions to problems that affect us all. Like, for example, how to teach online during the pandemic. Some of them, like my friend Bukari Sawadogo from Burkina Faso and Fernando Rias from Argentina, who are both college professors, they have even taught my students via Zoom, virtually, as virtual presenters. These educators have become my friends. They have hosted my children at their homes abroad, and I have hosted their children here in San Diego. And our children have become friends, and they have started, building their own international community networks. Today, I live on a typical one-block cul-de-sac in San Diego, which has American flags hanging here and there, and BLM signs, pride flags. My street is home to immigrants from Germany, Switzerland, Iran, Israel, Palestine, Brazil, and Argentina. Brazil and Argentina, let that sit for a minute. Those two countries together. The World Cup is a huge deal on my street. But our block parties are a celebration of the values we have in common. And they're the glue that bind our community together in spite of our differences and our occasional rivalries. When I put my BLM sign and my pride flag in front of my house, I do it because these things represent what I feel and what I believe in. That we live in a global community where everyone has the right to be treated equally and be welcomed with open arms and wholesome hearts. That's how my husband and I have raised our children, who have African-American cousins, Mexican-American cousins, Korean-American cousins, and cousins in Spain, in Australia, and in New Zealand. Because it's a parent's job to teach their children about tolerance, about acceptance. And we have encouraged our children to open their arms and their hearts to people who don't look like them or think like them. We have taught our kids to cherish the world's diversity and to welcome it with open arms. But sometimes the children teach the parents about being open-minded and open-hearted. Excuse me, I get a little emotional in this part. When my son was a junior in high school, he told us that he was transgender. And all of our travels and international connections and education, they had not prepared us for this. Now, we were no strangers to the LGBTQ community. My brother Dan is gay. He's very active in the gay community. And we have always welcomed him, his partners, his friends into our home and into our lives with open arms. Dan, he gets a kick out of telling our kids that he's their fun gay uncle. And we have gone to Pride together and to some of the events that he DJs for and that he sponsors all over the world. But, my son's, in spite of all this, my son's coming out, it hit me out of left field. I knew nothing about being transgender, and my ignorance rose between us like a gigantic wall. I didn't understand my child, and it was really hard for me to accept him, as him. My son, he told me that I didn't need to understand him. I just needed to accept him. But it was hard for me, I thought, first, I have to understand. And once I understand, then I can accept. And so I just kept hitting my head against that wall. One of the Dalai Lamas once said that an open heart is an open mind. And suddenly, it just clicked. I just got that. Of course I accept him. I love my son. And it doesn't matter what his name is, what pronouns he uses, what clothes he wears, or who he loves. What matters is that I love him, and I needed to show him that and accept him, tattoos and piercings included. So after my husband and I, we worked on opening our minds, and we read and we learned, and we, talked to each other a lot. We talked to our therapist. We talked to our son. We listened to him for many hours, him the teacher and us the students. And we listened to his friends, his ever-growing circle of LGBTQIA2S plus friends, who found a haven in our home. And they hung out there all the time, immersing us in their culture and their perspectives and in the issues that affected them. My husband and I, we did everything in our power to make sure that our son had the emotional, medical, and legal support that he needed to start life as a man. At first, that was so hard for me. I was terrified of what could happen to him out there. He looked so delicate to me, even dressed like a man. And I was afraid that he would get harassed or beaten up or who knows, maybe killed by people whose hearts and minds were closed tightly shut. The first time that I saw him use a men's restroom, in a restaurant, I was in a panic. But he said that men never looked at him twice in the men's restroom. The women's restroom, that's another story. He says that when trans people use a women's restroom, the women yell at them, throw things at them like rolls of toilet paper, and threaten to call the police. My son's path to a legal gender change was also blocked by ignorance, incompetence, and indifference. The sheer amount of paperwork required to make a legal change to your gender is mind-boggling. I've had my share of paperwork when I became an American citizen and when I got married, but nothing compares to the endless hours of making phone calls, making appointments, doctor's appointments, court appointments, psychiatrist appointments, therapist appointments, and going to all of these appointments, and filling out form after form after form after form, all to change one letter on your birth certificate. When we got him a new passport, we had to ask his doctor to write a letter 3 times because he kept writing the letter using the wrong pronouns. And the letter had to be written exactly the way the government asked for it. I was sickened and heartbroken by the lack of support, understanding, and by the prejudice and injustice that LGBTQ kids experience every day in their lives. My son's favorite therapist, she had a website that was filled with emojis, heart emojis and rainbow emojis and teddy bears and things. And those emojis, they represent what our LGBTQ kids need to survive in our world today. They need a lot of love, caring, compassion, and open arms and wholesome hearts. So, I agreed to be the GSA advisor here at school and the facilitator for our gender and sexuality identity support group because I wanted to offer our students a safe space where they could get together, interact, and where I could give them the support that I was not able to give my own son when he was a young teen and he was questioning his sexuality and his gender identity. And over the years, our GSA has worked on opening hearts and minds here so that everyone at Bonita is welcomed with open arms and wholesome hearts. Now, I think most of you know the bookstore, Barnes & Noble. You know, Barnes & Noble, they offer teachers a 20% discount on everything you buy that's for your classroom. So when you go there and you plop your pile of stuff, random things on the counter, the cashier always looks at it up and down and gives you the third degree and says, is all of this stuff for use in the classroom? Don't they know that as teachers, our entire lives are for use in the classroom? Everything I have ever owned, felt, lived, experienced, you know, all of my triumphs and my failures, and especially all of my relationships from my family, my friends, my colleagues, you know, my former students, and even the cashier at the supermarket who's from the Ivory Coast. I haven't talked him into it yet, but one of these days he'll be here. They work their ways into my lessons, you know, and they get these treasures. They're passed on to my students so that my experiences and the experiences of my friends and my relationships, they become my students' experiences. And they can put them, you know, in their toolkits so they can be some of the tools that they will need to navigate our fascinating and complex world with open arms and wholesome hearts. Thank you.